The morning sun spilled over the rooftops of Oakhaven like warm honey, soft and golden, glinting off the chrome bumpers of parked cars and the dew-dampened lawns that stretched in neat, quiet rows. It was the kind of Tuesday that felt suspended in calm, birds chirping from oak branches, the distant hum of a leaf blower, the faint scent of fresh-baked bread drifting from the corner bakery. Nothing out of place. Nothing unusual. At least not until a deep red Ferrari pulled into the small lot beside Brew & Co., the neighborhood coffee shop known more for its regulars than its espresso. The man behind the wheel stepped out slowly, stretching his arms above his head like someone who'd just finished a long night of work, not someone arriving for a morning caffeine fix. He wore a plain gray t-shirt, dark jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days, but his posture carried a quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. He ran a hand over the hood of the car almost affectionately before walking toward the shop, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the street with the ease of someone who belonged. Inside, the barista nodded with a familiar smile. "Usual?" she asked. "Black, no sugar," he replied, returning the nod. He leaned against the counter while he waited, scrolling through messages on his phone, reminders about a community meeting later that week, a text from his sister asking if he'd eaten, a note from city staff about finalizing the new housing initiative. His life had changed a lot in the past few months, but mornings like this still grounded him. No suits, no podiums, no cameras, just coffee, quiet, and the simple pleasure of a car he'd worked damn hard to afford. Outside, two people watched from a silver SUV parked across the street. They'd been sitting there for nearly 10 minutes, pretending to look at a map on a tablet, but their eyes kept darting toward the coffee shop. The man was in his late 50s with a stiff posture and a permanent furrow between his brows. The woman beside him, slightly younger, wore oversized sunglasses despite the mild morning light. They'd noticed the Ferrari the moment it turned onto Maple Avenue. In their minds, a car like that didn't belong in this part of town, certainly not driven by someone who looked like him. "He's just standing there," the woman muttered, voice low but sharp. "Yeah," the man replied, arms crossed. "Doesn't even look like he owns it." They didn't know him, had never seen him before, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the story they'd already written in their heads. A black man alone in a luxury vehicle that clearly cost more than their annual property taxes. It didn't fit. And when something doesn't fit in a place like Oakhaven, suspicion fills the gap. The woman reached for her phone. "I'm calling it in." "You sure?" "Someone's got to keep an eye out." What if it's stolen? She dialed 911 with practiced urgency, her voice trembling just enough to sound concerned, not cruel. "Hi, yes, I'm at Maple and 5th near Brew & Co. There's a man. He's hanging around a red Ferrari, acting really suspicious. I think he might be trying to steal it. He doesn't look like he belongs here." She gave a vague description, black, tall, wearing a gray shirt, and hung up before the dispatcher could ask follow-up questions. She didn't consider that maybe he lived nearby. That maybe he'd grown up just 3 blocks away, in a modest house his parents still owned. She didn't wonder if he paid taxes in this town, voted in its elections, or served on its committees. None of that crossed her mind. All she saw was a mismatch, and in her world mismatches were threats. Back at the coffee shop, the man took his cup and walked outside, sipping slowly as he leaned against the brick wall. He loved this spot, the way the morning light hit the pavement, the way neighbors waved even if they didn't know his name. He'd spent years fighting for this town to see people like him as part of its fabric, not as outsiders. And now, as mayor, he finally felt like change was possible. Real change. Not just speeches, but policies. Affordable housing, youth programs, police accountability measures that actually had teeth. He didn't notice the SUV across the street. Didn't see the woman lowering her sunglasses to stare. He was thinking about the meeting later that afternoon, about how to explain to residents why the new community center mattered, why every kid deserved a safe place to go after school. His mind was full of plans, not paranoia, but then he heard it, the distant wail of sirens growing louder. 2 police cruisers turned onto Maple Avenue, lights flashing but sirens off now, rolling to a stop just feet from where he stood. His stomach dropped. Not again. The officers stepped out slowly, hands resting near their belts, eyes locked on him. One was older with a thick mustache and a tired expression. The other was younger, maybe early 30s, shifting his weight like he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. "Sir," the older officer said, voice flat, "can we see some ID?" The man didn't flinch. He'd been here before, in parking lots, gas stations, even his own driveway. He reached into his back pocket slowly, making sure his movements were clear. "Of course," he said, handing over his driver's license. "And whose car is that?" The officer asked, nodding toward the Ferrari. "Mine." The younger officer glanced at the vehicle, then back at him, eyebrows raised slightly. "You mind if we check the registration?" "No problem." The man pulled out his phone, opened his digital wallet, and showed them the registration and insurance documents, both in his name, both matching the car's VIN. The officers exchanged a look. The older one radioed dispatch, reading off the license plate. There was a pause. Then the dispatcher's voice came through, calm but firm. "Vehicle is registered to Devin Carter." "Confirm identity." Another pause. Then quietly, "Be advised, that's Mayor Carter." The air changed instantly. The older officer's shoulders relaxed. The younger one actually took a half step back, his expression shifting from suspicion to something close to embarrassment. I didn't realize," the older officer said, handing back the phone. "Sorry for the trouble, sir." The man, Devin, just nodded. "It's okay," he said, though it wasn't. "Not really." He got back in his car, started the engine, and drove away without another word. But as he pulled onto the main road, his hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than before. The coffee sat untouched in the cup holder. The calm of the morning was gone, replaced by a familiar weight. The kind that settles in your chest when you realize, once again, that no matter how high you rise, some people will still see you as a threat first, a person second, and yet he didn't turn around. Didn't call the press. Didn't post anything online. He just kept driving, toward City Hall, toward the work that still needed doing. Because in Oak Haven, change didn't come from outrage alone. It came from showing up day after day, even when the world tried to tell you you didn't belong. The cruiser doors clicked shut behind the officers, but the tension didn't leave with them. It hung in the air like smoke after a fire, thin, invisible, but impossible to ignore. One officer stood near the front tire of the red Ferrari, arms loose but posture stiff, like he was bracing for something to go wrong. The other, younger one, kept glancing between the car, the man leaning against it and his own radio, as if hoping for instructions that would tell him exactly how to act. The man, Devin, didn't move aggressively. Didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, calm, waiting. He'd learned long ago that in moments like this, stillness was safer than motion, silence louder than protest. He handed over his license without drama, then pulled up the car's registration on his phone with slow, deliberate taps. Every gesture was measured, practiced, not out of fear but out of necessity. He knew how fast things could tilt the wrong way when a black man stood near something expensive that other people assumed he couldn't possibly own. The older officer squinted at the screen. "This says the car's registered to you," he said, more to himself than to Devin. "Yeah," Devin replied. "Bought it last year. Paid cash." There was a beat of silence. The younger officer shifted his weight, cleared his throat. "Mind if we check the VIN?" "Go ahead," Devin said, stepping aside to let them access the dashboard. As the older officer leaned in to verify the number, the younger one stayed back, eyes scanning the street. He noticed the silver SUV still idling across the road. The windows were tinted, but he could see two figures inside, watching. His stomach twisted slightly. He'd been on the force for 3 years, and he'd already seen enough to know how these calls usually went. How assumptions got dressed up as concern. How suspicious often just meant, "not like us." Back at the cruiser, the radio crackled again. Dispatch confirmed the VIN matched the registration. Then came the quiet update. "Subject is Mayor Devin Carter." "Repeat, that's the mayor." The older officer straightened up slowly, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he exhaled almost imperceptibly and turned to Devin. "Everything checks out, sir." "Sorry for the inconvenience," Devin nodded. "No problem, but it was a problem." And they all knew it. The officers returned to their cruiser without another word. No apology beyond the polite script. No acknowledgement of the assumption that had brought them here in the first place. Just a retreat into procedure, into the safety of protocol. Across the street, the couple in the SUV finally rolled down their windows an inch. The woman leaned forward, peering out like she expected someone to explain what had just happened. When the police cars pulled away without handcuffs, without drama, her face fell. She turned to the man beside her. "Well, that's strange," she said, voice tight. "Maybe he borrowed it?" The man grunted, starting the engine. "Doesn't matter. We did the right thing." They drove off, convinced they'd acted responsibly, never once considering that their right thing had just humiliated a public servant in broad daylight. Meanwhile, Devin sat in his car for a full minute before turning the key. His hands rested on the wheel, steady, but his mind raced. He thought about the meeting he was supposed to lead in 2 hours. A forum on neighborhood safety, ironically enough. He thought about the high school students who'd written him letters last month, thanking him for showing them that someone who looked like them could lead. He thought about his mother, who used to tell him to always carry your receipts, not because she doubted him, but because the world would. He took a slow breath, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot. The coffee sat forgotten in the cup holder, cold now. Back at City Hall, no one noticed anything was off. Staff bustled through the halls, phones ringing, papers shuffling. Devin walked straight to his office, exchanged a few quick words with his assistant about the afternoon agenda, and closed the door behind him. Only then did he let himself sink into his chair, rubbing his temples. He didn't want to make a scene. Didn't want this to become a spectacle, but he also couldn't pretend it didn't happen. Not when it was part of a pattern so old and deep it felt woven into the air itself. Later that morning, a city employee who'd been waiting in line at Brew & Co. during the incident sent him a short email. "Saw what happened. I recorded a bit of it if you want to see." Attached was a 45-second clip, grainy, shaky, but clear enough. It showed the officers approaching, Devin standing still, the couple watching from their SUV like spectators at a show they'd paid for. Devin watched it once, then deleted it. He didn't need proof. He'd lived it, but someone else didn't delete it. By early afternoon, the video was circulating among local community groups. Someone posted it to a neighborhood forum with the caption, "When your mayor gets treated like a suspect for owning a nice car." Within an hour, it jumped to social media. Comments poured in, some angry, some supportive, some dismissive. "Cops were just doing their job," one read. "Maybe he should have parked somewhere else," said another. But others saw what was really happening. A retired teacher wrote, "I've lived here 40 years. Never once been asked for ID while buying coffee." A young father added, "Hope my son never has to prove he belongs in his own town." The local news station caught wind of it by 3 p.m. A reporter called City Hall for comment. Devin's team asked if he wanted to issue a statement. He thought about it for a long moment, then said, "Just tell them I'm focused on the housing forum tonight. This isn't about me, it's about who gets the benefit of the doubt in Oak Haven." That line stuck. By evening, it was quoted in 3 different articles. At the forum, the room was packed, more than usual. People stood in the back, sat on the floor, leaned against the walls. Some came because of the video. Others came because they'd heard rumors. But most came because they were tired. Tired of feeling like their neighborhood only welcomed certain kinds of people. Devin didn't mention the incident outright. He didn't need to. When he spoke about building a city where everyone feels seen, the room understood. When he talked about trust being a two-way street, people nodded like he'd named something they'd carried for years but never voiced. Afterward, an elderly woman approached him, eyes glistening. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not making it about anger. For making it about us," he smiled gently. "It's always been about us." Back home that night, Devin sat on his porch, the city lights flickering in the distance. The Ferrari sat in the driveway, gleaming under the street lamp. It wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of hard work, yes, but also of visibility, of refusing to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. He knew the couple from the SUV wouldn't lose sleep over what they'd done. Maybe they'd even double down, tell friends they'd been tricked or misled. But that wasn't his burden to carry. His job wasn't to convince them he belonged. It was to build a town where belonging didn't have to be proven at all. The video didn't explode overnight, it seeped. First into neighborhood group chats, then local Facebook pages, then a late-night post on a regional news blog that someone tagged in a dozen different community forums. By the next morning, it had legs, not the kind that sprinted across headlines with sirens and outrage, but the quiet, steady kind that lingers in conversations at bus stops, grocery lines, and school pickups. People weren't just watching it, they were talking about it. And that made all the difference. The footage itself was unpolished. Shot on a phone from across the street, it showed a man in a gray t-shirt standing beside a red sports car, sipping coffee like any other Tuesday. Then came the police cruisers, the slow approach, the way the officers' hands hovered near their belts even before a single word was spoken. The real punch wasn't in the confrontation. It was in the silence afterward. The way the man didn't argue, didn't flinch, just handed over his papers like he'd done it 100 times before. And then, the quiet twist. The radio crackling with the words, "That's Mayor Carter." That moment, the shift in the officer's posture, the sudden softening of their tone, was what stuck with people. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no arrests, no violence. Just a small, everyday betrayal of trust laid bare in real time, and because it was so ordinary, it felt more true. By noon, a local activist had clipped the video, added subtitles for clarity, and posted it with a simple caption, "This is what bias looks like when it wears a suit and calls 911. Within hours, shares climbed into the thousands. Not because it was shocking, many had lived versions of it, but because it was undeniable. A man clearly doing nothing wrong, treated like a suspect purely because of how he looked and what he drove. News outlets picked it up cautiously at first. One station ran a short segment during the evening broadcast, framing it as a case of mistaken identity. But viewers pushed back in the comments. Mistaken identity? He was standing next to his own car. Another outlet interviewed a legal expert who pointed out that while the officers followed procedure, the initial call was based on zero evidence, just assumption. "That's not vigilance," the expert said. "That's profiling dressed up as civic duty." Meanwhile, the mayor's office stayed quiet. No press conference, no fiery statement, just a brief note released midday. The mayor appreciates the public's concern. He remains focused on his duties and the upcoming community initiatives. It was calm, measured, almost too calm for the internet, which thrives on reaction. But that restraint sparked something else, a deeper kind of respect. People began sharing stories of their own. The time they were followed in a store, questioned while walking their dog, asked to prove they lived in their own apartment building. The video became a mirror, and more people saw themselves in it than anyone expected. At a high school 2 miles away, a teacher paused her lesson on civil rights and played the clip for her students. "What do you notice?" she asked. "He didn't even raise his voice," one student said. "But they still treated him like he was guilty," another added. "And the people in the SUV, they never even got out of their car to ask," a third pointed out. The discussion lasted the whole period. By the end, the class had drafted a letter to the city council requesting a student-led forum on bias and public safety. They didn't wait for permission. They just started organizing. Back in Oak Haven, the couple who made the call began to feel the heat. Their neighbors, who'd once waved from driveways or exchanged pleasantries at the mailbox, now looked away when they passed. A grocery clerk who used to chat with them about the weather suddenly became all business. Their son, home from college, called in a panic after seeing the video circulating on campus. "Do people know it's you?" he asked, voice tight. They insisted it was a misunderstanding, that they'd only been looking out for the neighborhood. But the more they defended themselves, the smaller their story sounded. They hired a lawyer, not because they were in legal trouble, but because they wanted to issue a statement that protected their reputation. The draft came back polished and vague. "We regret any distress caused and support our community leaders." It said nothing about race, nothing about assumption, nothing about the fact that they'd called the police on a man for simply existing in a nice car. When it leaked online, the response was swift. "Regret any distress? How about regretting the call itself?" Still, the mayor didn't engage. He didn't name them, didn't shame them. At a small business roundtable that afternoon, someone asked him directly, "Are you going to press charges or file a complaint?" He paused, set down his water glass, and looked around the room. "What would that fix?" he asked gently. "Punishing 2 people won't change the system that taught them it was okay to assume the worst about someone who looks different. I'd rather spend that energy building something better." The room fell quiet. Then someone started clapping. Others joined, not out of pity but out of admiration, for choosing repair over revenge. That night, A local artist projected the video onto the side of an empty storefront downtown, but with one change. Every time the officers approached, the screen faded to black, and white text appeared, "What if he'd been your son?" People stopped to watch. Some cried. Others just stood in silence, arms crossed, thinking. Online, the conversation shifted too. Less about the couple, more about the pattern. Teachers shared lesson plans on implicit bias. Barbershops hosted informal talks. A group of retired police officers wrote an open letter calling for better training, not as a punishment but as a promise to do better. And through it all, the mayor kept working. He met with housing advocates, reviewed budget proposals, visited a youth center opening in the north end of town. He didn't posture, didn't perform. He just showed up, calm, consistent, human, because in the end the video wasn't really about a Ferrari or a coffee run, or even a wrong 911 call. It was about who gets to walk through the world without being questioned. And for the first time in a long time, Oakhaven was asking itself that question, not with anger but with honesty. That honesty was uncomfortable, messy, full of awkward silences and hard truths. But it was also alive. And in that aliveness, something new began to grow. Not from outrage, but from the quiet, stubborn belief that a town could learn to see itself clearly and choose to do better. The pressure didn't come in one loud wave. It built slowly, like water rising in a quiet room. At first, it was just murmurs, neighbors avoiding eye contact, a local paper running an editorial about community trust, a few anonymous letters, left at City Hall asking, "What now?" But soon the questions got louder. Parents wanted answers for their kids. Teachers asked how to explain what happened. Even some officers off duty and out of uniform admitted they'd seen this kind of thing before and hated that nothing ever changed. The police department issued a short statement saying they were reviewing the incident internally. It sounded official but vague enough to mean almost nothing. That only made people more restless. They didn't want reviews. They wanted reckoning. Then came the town hall. It wasn't scheduled at first. The mayor had been planning a routine, update on the new housing project, but after the video spread and the community buzz grew too loud to ignore, his team quietly shifted the focus. Flyers went up in libraries, community centers, even laundromats. A conversation about belonging open to all. No promises, no agendas, just a room, some chairs, and an invitation to talk. The night of the event, the high school auditorium filled faster than anyone expected. People spilled into the aisles, stood along the back wall, even sat on the steps leading to the stage. There were seniors with canes, teenagers with notebooks, shop owners in aprons still dusted with flour. Some came angry. Some came curious. Many came because they'd never been asked to sit in the same room and talk about race, safety, and who gets treated like they belong. The mayor walked in alone. No podium, no entourage, just a mic and a chair. He didn't start with a speech. He started with a story. He talked about being 12 years old, riding his bike home from the library with a stack of books, when a police car pulled up beside him. The officer asked where he got the bike. He said, "It's mine." The officer asked for proof. He didn't have a receipt, so he had to walk the bike to his house 3 blocks away while the officer followed slowly behind, watching. His mother came to the door, furious and embarrassed. She showed the officer the bike's serial number, written in her neat handwriting inside the frame. The officer apologized and left. But the feeling stayed. The feeling that no matter how honest you were, how clean your hands, someone might still see you as a problem. The room was silent. You could hear someone sniffle in the 3rd row. Then, he talked about college, about job interviews where he was told he was articulate, about neighbors who smiled but never invited him in. He didn't say these things to shame anyone. He said them to show that this wasn't just about one morning, one car, one phone call. It was about a lifetime of small moments that add up to a heavy weight. And the truth is, he said, voice low but steady, "I'm the mayor now. I have a title. A car people notice, a seat at the table. But none of that erased the moment I stood by my own car and felt like I had to prove I wasn't stealing it. That's not about me. That's about us." about what we accept as normal. After he finished, he opened the floor, not to speeches but to real talk. A retired teacher stood first. "I've lived here 42 years, she said. I never realized how many people felt invisible in their own town until now." A young father spoke next. "I don't want my son to grow up afraid to drive a nice car." Then a woman who worked at the coffee shop that morning. "I saw it happen, and I didn't say anything. I wish I had." One by one, people shared, not to blame, but to understand. Even a few officers came, sitting in the back. One raised his hand near the end. "I joined the force to help," he said, voice rough. "But sometimes the system makes it hard to see people, not just suspects. We need to do better, and I'm ready to learn." That night something shifted. Not because laws changed or apologies were made, but because people finally looked at each other, not as symbols, but as neighbors. In the days that followed, the mayor's office announced 2 new initiatives. First, a civilian oversight committee, made up of residents from every part of town, including former critics, to review police calls involving bias or questionable stops. Second, a partnership with local universities to design bias training. That wasn't just a checkbox, but real conversations led by community members, not consultants. The police chief, who'd been quiet since the incident, surprised everyone by showing up to the first planning meeting. He didn't make excuses. He listened. And when someone asked if he'd support officers being held accountable for unwarranted stops, he said, "If we're not accountable, we're not serving." Back in their new house, yes, they'd moved quietly to a neighboring town. The couple who made the call watched the town hall replay online. They didn't comment, didn't share. But later, the woman called her sister and said, "I think I misunderstood what was happening that day." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was a crack in the wall. And sometimes that's where change starts. Meanwhile, the mayor kept working. He visited the youth center again, this time with a group of high schoolers who'd started a Know Your Rights workshop. He met with small business owners worried about being profiled during late-night deposits. He even sat down with the barista from Brew & Cower, who admitted she'd been too scared to speak up that morning, but now wanted to help train staff on how to be allies, not bystanders. None of it was perfect. There were still arguments at council meetings, still people who said, "Why make such a big deal out of nothing?" But the nothing didn't feel so small anymore, because what happened that morning by the coffee shop wasn't really about a red car. It was about who gets to exist without explanation. And for the first time, Oakhaven wasn't just asking that question, it was trying to answer it, together, one honest conversation at a time. Months passed and the red Ferrari became a familiar sight outside City Hall, not as a symbol of luxury but as a quiet reminder of what had changed and what still needed to. The mayor parked it in the same spot every morning, rain or shine, and walked inside without fanfare. No cameras followed him. No crowds gathered. Life in Oakhaven had settled into a new kind of rhythm, one that wasn't perfect but was trying. The incident by the coffee shop never disappeared completely. It lived in the town's memory like a scar, not always visible but always there, shaping how people moved through the world. But instead of letting it fester, the community had done something rare. They'd turned it into a starting point, not an ending. The youth center that opened in the north end of town became more than just a place with ping-pong tables and computers. It hosted weekly community circles where teens and elders, newcomers and lifelong residents sat together and talked about everything from school stress to what safety really meant. One wall was covered in hand-painted tiles, each one bearing a single word chosen by a visitor. Seen, heard, welcome, enough. At the police department, things shifted slowly but surely. The new bias training wasn't a one-time lecture. It was ongoing, role-playing scenarios, listening sessions with residents, even ride-alongs with community members. Officers began keeping reflection logs, not to track arrests, but to note moments when their assumptions might have clouded their judgment. It wasn't about shame. It was about awareness, and surprisingly, many officers said it made them better at their jobs. The Civilian Oversight Committee held its first public review 3 months after forming. It wasn't dramatic, no firings, no headlines, but it was real. They examined a handful of recent 911 calls flagged for potential bias. spoke with callers and officers alike, and issued gentle but firm recommendations. Clearer dispatcher questions, better documentation, and a public dashboard showing call trends with privacy protected. Most importantly, they made it clear that suspicious wasn't enough of a reason to send police. There had to be behavior, actual evidence, not just discomfort. Meanwhile, the couple who'd made the original call never returned to Oakhaven. They sold their house quietly and moved about 20 miles away. No grand apology, no interview, just absence. And in their place, something unexpected grew, not resentment but reflection. Neighbors who once nodded politely at them now asked harder questions at block meetings. "How do we make sure this doesn't happen again?" Someone asked at a garden club gathering. The conversation lasted 2 hours. The mayor never mentioned them by name, not in speeches, not in interviews, not even in private. He knew that focusing on 2 people would let the bigger system off the hook. His work wasn't about punishment. It was about building something that made that kind of assumption unnecessary. He poured his energy into the housing initiative, which finally broke ground that spring. It wasn't just affordable units, it was mixed income with green space, a community kitchen, and a small art studio run by local creators. At the groundbreaking ceremony, kids from the youth center planted sunflowers along the fence. One of them handed the mayor a seedling in a paper cup. "For your office," she said. He still has it on his windowsill, now a tall, leafy plant reaching for the light. Schools changed too. The high school that had shown the video in class launched a belonging project, where students interviewed elders in the community about their experiences with fairness and exclusion. The stories were compiled into a book, printed and placed in the library. A history teacher rewrote part of her curriculum to include local civil rights efforts that had been overlooked for decades. "We can't fix what we don't remember," she told her students. Even small businesses got involved. Brew & Co. started hosting neighbor nights, free coffee, open mic, no agenda. The barista who'd served the mayor that morning now led a monthly workshop on bystander intervention. "It's not about being a hero," she'd say. "It's about saying something when something feels off." And the mayor? He kept showing up, not as a symbol but as a person. He ate lunch in the food court downtown. He walked his dog in the park. He stopped to talk to street vendors, bus drivers, kids waiting for the school bell. People still recognized him, of course, but the awe had faded into something warmer. Familiarity. Trust. One evening, as summer turned to fall, he stood on his porch again, watching fireflies blink over the backyard. His phone buzzed, a text from his sister. "Saw Mrs. Langley at the market. She said you helped her get that ramp installed." She cried. He smiled. That's the work no one films. The quiet fixes, the unseen connections. He thought about how far they'd come. Not because one person stood up, but because many chose to lean in. Not with anger, but with curiosity. Not with blame, but with responsibility. Oakhaven wasn't perfect. There were still arguments at council meetings. Still moments when old habits resurfaced. But something fundamental had shifted. People now paused before calling 911. Officers asked more questions before making assumptions. Kids grew up seeing a black man lead their town. Not as an exception, but as part of the fabric, and the red Ferrari. It still turned heads sometimes. But now, when people saw it parked outside City Hall, they didn't wonder who it belonged to. They just nodded and kept walking, because they knew, deep down, that it belonged exactly where it was. In the end, the story wasn't about a car, or a call, or even a mayor. It was about a town learning that belonging isn't earned through titles or possessions. It's given freely, or it's not belonging at all. And Oakhaven slowly, stubbornly, beautifully was choosing to give it.